Okay, man, Rock T's here, sitting outside of the National Civil Rights Museum with Ryan Jones, the historian. And he's going to talk and keep it real about some of the conspiracies about Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. You ready, man?
Sure, let's take it on. I mean, it just seems very, very implausible about James Earl Ray's abilities to commit this crime. You have to understand Dr. King's tone at this point. His opposition to the Vietnam War made him a major target in this country's history. He died the most hated man in the world, but now he's one of the most glorified men in the world. And I think when we look at some of the circumstances of this assassination, there are just some things that just don't completely fit together 100%. James Earl Ray was involved with some very interesting characters, and I believe that James Earl Ray took a lot of secrets to his grave, unfortunately, when he passed away some 20 years ago. And so once we look into the assassination, we kind of have to look at who had the most to gain, who could have funded this, and who could have completely put this together. At the moment right now, in my opinion personally, it just seems to be a little bit more to that. Again, as a employee of the National Civil Rights Museum, we interpret both sides of the story and allow our guests to determine what likely could have.
So stay tuned. Get ready, because he's going to shoot it straight from the hip, and I'm going to ask him straight questions that he's not going to run from any other answers. He's going to take us through and walk us from 1963. Now, we don't want to go all the way back before then. Let's start from 1963 with the church bombings in Birmingham and the walk on the March on Washington.
Sure. Well, Birmingham was an extremely important part of the civil rights movement and in Dr. King's life. He's already a household name. He's completed the Montgomery bus boycotts in 1955 and 1956. But 1963 in Birmingham is very critical. Birmingham is the most segregated city in America. Dr. King knows that the Kennedy administration is on brink of completing a civil rights bill, and they know that they will have that here because of the Birmingham Police Commissioner of Public Safety, who we see behind us, Bull Connor. Bull Connor is the Birmingham Police Commissioner of Public Safety. You can see what he believes about the law. The climate here is that Birmingham is nicknamed Bombingham. It is the African American section known as Dynamite Hill, and it's also the period where the governor, George Wallace, has signed in. So this is the climate in which Dr. King is coming into the city of Birmingham. On Good Friday, 1963, Dr. King is arrested for participating in a protest. And while he's in jail in Birmingham, Alabama, white clergymen come to visit him. These are white moderate clergymen, and they're calling for Dr. King coming to Birmingham unjust, it's untimely, let's have a cooling off period. And so Martin Luther King Jr. responds to this criticism in what we know today as the letter from a Birmingham jail, where he's saying an unjust law is no law at all, justice delayed is justice denied. And it's probably the most important composition written in the 20th century. Immediately after Dr. King is arrested, he encourages children of all ages, 7 to 17 years old, to come and get involved in the struggle in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's those infamous images of children being attacked by Bull Connor's water hoses and German shepherds, which is what completely embarrasses the entire United States of America. On Tuesday, June 11th, 1963, President John F. Kennedy proposes to Congress a civil rights bill. And this bill is what will end up becoming the Civil Rights Act of 1964, equally ending segregation in all public life. This was the biggest accomplishment of the civil rights movement up until that point, but the city of Birmingham did live up to its name, Bombingham. On Sunday, September 15th, 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church is bombed by 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan. These 4 little girls, ages 11 to 14, were murdered by this bomb. And these 2 young African-American men were killed in white power rallies shortly after the bombing took place. Many historians and many people are not familiar with the murders of Virgil Ware and Johnny Robinson. So later that year, just weeks after Birmingham has been declared a victory, 250,000 Americans gathered here at the nation's capital on Wednesday, August 28th, 1963. And Dr. King and others began to plan a march en route for the civil rights bill that will be passed the following year. So it was on this march that 250,000 Americans gather at the Lincoln Memorial, and they hear people from Daisy Bates, John Lewis, and of course Dr. King's most iconic speech today, the I Have a Dream speech. This is probably the biggest civil rights demonstration in our nation's history. None has come close to touching it ever since then. And so because of what's going on here, because of the marching that happens in Birmingham, President Johnson signs into the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, but there's still a problem. African Americans are severely denied the right to vote.
Right.
That's what brings us to Selma in 1965.
Gotcha. And in 1965, that was when the Voters' Rights Act.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
Correct.
Okay, now let's fast forward to 1968, because he came to the city of Memphis before April the 4th.
Absolutely.
And what happened in that march demonstration?
Well, in 1966, Dr. King comes to Memphis in June of 1966. Civil rights legend James Meredith is shot. He's not fatally wounded, but he is shot on the outskirts of Memphis in a small town called Hernando, Mississippi. And Dr. King comes to Memphis on his behalf. And it's there that he and a young Stokely Carmichael decide to march from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi. That planning strategy actually occurred here in the Lorraine Motel in room 307, which most people believe that his only room was only 306. We'll get to that as we go forward to the assassination. But on that march, of course, Stokely Carmichael, who's known as a black militant, calls for black power for the very first time, challenging the limitations of nonviolent resistance in the civil rights movement. The movement was becoming a lot younger. People were no longer going to side with Dr. King at this point. And the media and culture has beginning to change during this period. Many movement makers are forgetting about spirituals. They're beginning to sing message songs. Culture is completely changing. Dr. King, as a civil rights leader, is changing. He's evolving into a completely different man by this period. He is not just tackling racial issues, he's tackling economic injustice, and he unequivocally speaks out on his opposition to the Vietnam War.
It's amazing, because as we're sitting here walking, it takes you through, just the atmosphere
Certainly.
that was going on at the time.
Certainly.
And it's kind of eerie a little bit.
Yeah, well, we're really back in these rooms that we're in. These are rooms here in the Lorraine Motel that were once taken out. So now that we're in Memphis, why did Martin Luther King come to Memphis in the spring of 1968? Well, on Thursday, February the 1st, 1968, two sanitation workers are trying to get out of the thunderstorm that's occurring here in Memphis, Tennessee. These two men are actually crushed to death in the back of a truck because they're unable to stand inside of the waiting room and inside of the cab itself. And so 1,100 sanitation workers strike against their employer several days later, and this is when the iconic speech in March of I Am a Man begins to happen across the city. This caught Dr. King's attention. He had already begun to plan another demonstration called the Poor People's Campaign, which this was just a detour of that. He comes to Memphis on the 28th of March. He leads a march that he really wasn't responsible for. He just was going to participate in it, and it turns into complete chaos, forcing him to retreat. So he vows the next day to come back to the city of Memphis on April the 3rd. 50 years ago today, Dr. King flies on Eastern Airlines Flight 381 from Atlanta, and he arrives here in Memphis, Tennessee, and at approximately 11:20 that morning, he checks in with Ralph Abernathy in room 306 of the Lorraine Motel. And so on that day of today, 50 years ago, it's a very eerie, as you were just talking about, it was tornado warnings in the greater Memphis area. We're having inclement weather that we're expecting in the next several hours. And Dr. King was suffering from laryngitis that afternoon. He's got flu-like symptoms. He's just completely emotionally and physically drained. And so he sends to the Mason Temple that night his closest associates, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and later UN Ambassador Andrew Young, to speak on his behalf. Once they arrive there, they see that over 3,000 people are in the audience, in spite of the weather. They rush and call Dr. King over at the Lorraine. They said, listen, this is your crowd. You need to come to Memphis. You need to come to the Mason Temple on that day. And Dr. King says something that night that he hadn't said in any of his other profound speeches in 12 years. He looks to the audience and he says, like anyone, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now because I've been to the mountaintop and I've looked over, I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So tonight I'm not worried. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And 50 years ago today, he delivered that speech. And what we didn't know at the time was that that was his final address to the public. That's the way that he goes out.
Let's back up real fast and tell me a little bit about history about the actual Lorraine Motel itself.
Sure. So the Lorraine Motel originally was known as the Windsor Hotel. It opened in 1925 as a white-only establishment. And an African-American couple by the name of Walter and Lori Bailey purchased this property in 1945, and they renamed it as the Lorraine. And so in the 50s and 60s, in the height of the civil rights movement, celebrities such as Jackie Robinson, Sam Cooke, Ray Charles, Sarah Vaughan, Count Basie, anyone you could think of, when they would make their way into Memphis, they would stay at the Lorraine Motel. It was just known as a safe haven kind of environment, including Martin Luther King Jr., who stayed here a known 3 times that were documented. April the 4th, 1968 started out as a very uneventful day. Dr. King was in an unusually joyous mood. Up until this point, he was very emotionally distressed, but according to his associates, it's as if he preached the fear of death from his soul. So on the afternoon of Thursday, April the 4th, 1968, Dr. King and his associates are just here at the Lorraine waiting for Andrew Young to return from the injunction court that morning. Once they arrive back, everyone is having pillow fights in the Lorraine Motel. They're getting ready to go and eat dinner at a local Memphis minister's home, Billy Kyle's. And so Dr. King walks up the stairs to room 306. He gets dressed. At around 10 till 6 p.m., Dr. King reappears on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He's approached by some of his confidants. One of the first is Reverend Jesse Jackson at this time, and he looks down at Jesse and he says, "Jesse, I want you to go to dinner with me tonight." And Jesse Jackson says that, "Do I need to wear a tie?" And Dr. King says, "Absolutely." He says, "Well, Doc, I have an appetite, and that is what is a prerequisite for dinner, not a tie." And then both men laugh about it. Several minutes later, he's introduced to a Memphis musician named Ben Branch. Ben Branch is a jazz saxophonist, and Dr. King requests that Ben Branch play his favorite spiritual, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand, I Want You to Play It Real Pretty." He's then approached by his chauffeur, Solomon Jones. Solomon Jones was going to be driving that night the 68 Cadillac to dinner, and Solomon Jones calls up to Dr. King on the balcony and says, "Doc, you should go and grab your jacket outside. It's getting kind of cold." And Martin Luther King Jr.'s final words were, "Do you really think I'll need a coat?" And at that exact moment, from 6:01 p.m., a fatal shot rings out, and he's hit in the lower jaw, upper neck area, and he falls mortally wounded on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. Immediately, the Memphis Police Department rushed onto the scene of the Lorraine Motel, and as they are running towards the balcony, they are pointing in this direction, saying, "No, you don't need to come this way. Go towards where we believe the shot was fired." That infamous photograph that we see of Dr. King lying in a pool of blood was taken at approximately 6:04 p.m. by South African journalist Joseph Lau. Dr. King was taken from the balcony to St. Joseph's Hospital, and he's pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. Dr. King was not the only tragic event that occurred that day on the assassination. The motel owner's wife, Mrs. Lori Bailey, walks out and sees what happens to Dr. King, and she actually has a stroke and dies 5 days later from being in shock of what had happened here at the Lorraine Motel. So the owner, Mr. Walter Bailey, refuses to check out room 306 as a memorial to Dr. King, and 307 after his wife dies on April the 9th, 1968, the day of Dr. King's funeral in Atlanta, Georgia.
Now, you mentioned the Cadillac and the Dodge just sitting over here. Are these the actual cars from 1968?
These are replicas of those cars.
Okay, so they're replicas of the cars.
Correct. These cars right here are replicas of what they look like. These were the exact same models that were here, a 1959 Dodge and a 1968 Cadillac. So what we have done here at the National Civil Rights Museum is that we have put to make it look like what it looked like on that day. When you look at the photographs that you see of the men pointing in this direction, these photographs were caught in that picture. And so we wanted to really create the effect of what it looked like at the time of the assassination.
Wow. Now, you keep pointing over in that direction.
Correct.
That is where
So if we look this way, we look straight ahead.
That's where the shot came from.
This is where the FBI believes the fatal shot was fired from. As you see over here in this area right here, we're able to see this is a back of the boarding house where they believe that men was in this area and the fatal shot was fired in this area in that way. During this time over here, there were tall grass and shrubbery. Once we go inside of this building over here, we go into the investigation of the assassination. We'll go into the circumstances of it.
Okay, so where we're standing right now is inside what is now the Legacy Building, but it was called something else before.
It was called the Young and Morrow Rooming House, owned by a woman named Bessie Brewer and her husband. And so on the day of the assassination, according to the FBI, a 40-year-old man using an alias named John Willard checked into a room on the second floor. We'll see that room in just a second, but according to the authorities, James O'Ray at the time checked out of this room and he came into this community bathroom that we see behind us. Perching himself into this bathtub, James O'Ray took a .30-06 Remington Game Master and allegedly fired the shot that killed Dr. King. As you come outside, you're able to see a much more view of what it would have maybe looked like had Ray been the assassin. Across, wow. You can see the Lorraine Motel, which is from here approximately 205 feet away.
That's a straight shot.
James O'Ray sees that he's hit King. He comes out of this bathroom. He goes back into this room over that we are behind here. He gathers some more of his belongings, and that's the room.
So this is a room that James Earl Ray stayed in.
Correct. Yeah, this is the room that he checked into at about 3 p.m. on the day of the assassination. Room 5B of the Young and Morrow Rooming House, using the alias of John Willard. He runs downstairs and he runs outside, and James O'Ray is unaware if there's a police officer in his view, and so Ray panics and drops the bundle right outside of these doors, which we'll see in a few minutes. He gets into a 1966 Mustang and he runs and he drives from Memphis to Atlanta, Georgia. The next day, Friday, April the 5th, he abandons the Mustang and James O'Ray takes a one-way Greyhound bus ticket to Toronto, Canada. And he stays in Toronto for 11 days. After being in Toronto for 11 days, he has 5 different aliases with 5 men that look exactly like him, using the alias of John Willard, Harvey Lohmeyer, Eric Galt, Ramon Sneed, and Paul Bridgman. When asked in 1977 by the House Select Committee of Assassinations, he gave no credible explanation how he received these aliases. And so when Ray finally flies to London, England, he's caught, and 65 days later, after the assassination of Dr. King, he's brought back to the city of Memphis in extradition, and he's pleading not guilty to the murder of Dr. King. He fires his first sets of attorney in November '68. He hires another man by the name of Percy Foreman of the state of Texas, and Mr. Foreman pretty much has no intent of taking this case to trial. He tells Ray that if you go to trial and you're convicted, you'll get capital punishment. So Ray reluctantly takes a plea bargain, entering a judicial admission of guilt for the murder of Dr. King. In return, he's given 99 years. After he gets 99 years, he recants this judicial admission of guilt, and he says that he would like to have a trial here in Memphis. What Ray's confession was that I'm entering this only via court of law. I'm not saying I murdered Martin Luther King Jr. So when it comes out that he's being known as the triggerman and the shooterman, he decides that he does not want to have that judicial admission of guilt. He would rather take his chances in trial. He's unsuccessful in having a trial here in Memphis. He dies on April the 23rd, 1998 of complications of hepatitis B.
Which is where one of the conspiracy theories come in. So we allegedly don't know if James Earl Ray really shot Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
It's just too implausible to say without complete certainty that Ray was the shooter. There's certain evidence that may imply that Ray had some kind of knowledge of the plot, but it's a lot of concerning evidence that suggests that he most likely did not. It's no secret that Dr. King's family longly believes that James O'Ray is an innocent man and was not the trigger man, and they have a lot of reasons for thinking that. We can go into some of those as well.
Right. Now, you mentioned the white Mustang.
Correct.
Let's go check that out.
James O'Ray bought this Mustang in December 1967 in Birmingham, Alabama for about $1,900, a 66 Mustang. It has Alabama plates on it, and according to the FBI, James O'Ray drove this Mustang from Birmingham to Los Angeles. He's said to have been in Los Angeles participating in George Wallace's campaign as the independent candidate for the presidency of the United States in the election of 1968. This is the Mustang. This is the model Mustang that they believe was on the outside on South Main Street as he checked into what we are in now, which is the Young and Morrow rooming house building.
Okay, now this is a tough one I got for you.
Okay.
Is it true that the rifle and other evidence is downstairs?
It's actually right across the hall over here.
Get out of here.
Walk right over this way. Yeah.
Real evidence. These are not replicas.
So this part of the National Civil Rights Museum actually opened in 2002, and once this site was annexed as a part of the museum, the state of Tennessee gave all of the evidence that it had on James Earl Ray had he gone to trial, and they donated it to us, the National Civil Rights Museum. Number 11 is the actual bullet slug that was removed from Dr. King's body during his autopsy. That's the actual autopsy report performed by Dr. Jerry Francisco. And these are a lot of other things that James Earl Ray is said to have had in a green duffel bag, which was found not only 300 feet away from the crime scene itself. And so these artifacts are on permanent loan by the state of Tennessee to here the museum.
And that's the rifle.
This is the rifle that the FBI believes was the fatal shot.
Wow. So now we're outside in the grass area where he appeared to, after allegedly taking the shot, gathered his things, ran out here, and dropped the rifle, the duffel bag, all of this stuff.
When you look into the investigation of the assassination, the eyewitnesses don't believe that they saw anything in that area.
Right.
Instead, in the Lorraine Motel, which we see straight across from us over here, when the shot rang out, they all ducked and they saw this was all tall grass and shrubbery. This was cut down in the middle of the night after the assassination, by the Memphis Public Works Department. Who ordered that, we don't know. It was cut down at 4:30 a.m. 6 eyewitnesses saw a man run and jump from this area off of this retaining wall and run this way. And they saw gun smoke in this area. All 6 of these eyewitnesses were completely ignored by the Memphis police and the Memphis FBI. Second, the rifle that we saw upstairs was never tested for its trajectory and its ballistics properly by the FBI. It was not really tested until 1997. Each and every single time, the slug that was removed from Dr. King's face never conclusively matches up to the gun that we house here in the National Civil Rights
Museum. Okay, hold
Museum.
on. So the slug that was removed does not match the gun that we just saw.
It's inconclusive. It could match, but it was not a conclusive match. Usually in ballistics, that would be a home run.
Right.
This was not a home run case.
Okay, so if James Earl Ray came out and, according to the story, he dropped the rifle, the bag, and everything right here where we're standing, why would he do that?
Yeah. Well, they said,
If you're trying to get away,
right,
why would you drop evidence in the open?
Yeah. Well, Ray actually dropped this right at this side wall. We can walk over there and see that. This is where they believe. This is where men and women who believe that Ray was not the assassin took the shot. So if you can see the trajectory down in the bathroom, it's a lot more different of an angle and a much more kill shot. So this is Memphis's grassy knoll, as you could say.
Right.
That was completely altered just hours after the assassination. This is where people believe the fatal shot was fired versus James Earl Ray's theory that he shot from that bathroom upstairs. But it poses a very good question. Why would Ray, who's supposed to be a major assassin, drop incriminating evidence on his behalf just 300 feet from the crime scene of where Dr. King was killed?
Well, let me ask you.
Well,
in your opinion, what do you think?
I believe that Dr. King was killed under extremely complex situations. You know, Dr. King, this could not have been a hate crime. I think that you have to question James Earl Ray's motive, and his ability, for that matter. Every crime that he committed up until that point was a very, very petty, small crime. To be able to trace Dr. King unannounced he purchases 2 separate rifles. This area right here is cut down. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a normal guest at the Lorraine Motel. There is African-American fire workers that are working at this fire station on the day of the assassination as a way of protection and security, and they're removed only 90 minutes before the assassination takes place. And with the trajectory and the ballistics report not being conclusive, I think that Dr. King was killed because of his intent to have the Poor People's Campaign in Washington later that April. It just doesn't. I have a really tough time believing the official investigation as an independent researcher in this case. Of course, the National Civil Rights Museum tells both narratives of this story, and we allow our guests to determine what likely happened on that tragic day.
Okay, so now you're walking me over to where the rifle was dropped.
Yeah, on South Main Street. So we'll show the door what Ray likely came out of, and then we'll show you where he dropped the rifle.
Okay, so it's starting to make a little more sense, because right after the shot, after Dr. Martin Luther King went down, you say the 6 witnesses saw a man in the grassy knoll area that we just left.
That's correct.
And smoke.
And gun smoke.
In gun smoke. So if it was James Earl Ray upstairs in that window, he wouldn't be able to get downstairs that fast, that instantly.
Couldn't have been him. Had to have been another person.
Uh-oh.
It's true. And so right here, this is the door. 422 and a half. This is the door that James Earl Ray, allegedly after committing the assassination, runs out. He's got a bundle in his hand, and kind of where these cars are on the street of Main Street, he sees a police car. He doesn't know if there is a police officer inside this car, so he has a decision to make. Does he put this in his possession, or does he abandon it? He drops the rifle right here, runs into the Mustang, and drives off. And so, maybe 2.5 minutes after the shots fired, this is all found. The Mustang is gone.
Wow.
So it's a lot to take in. It's a lot to think about. But 50 years later, we still have lingering questions as to who would have been the motive for what may have occurred on that day.